Just firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this. Whenever I come back, my accent is somewhere floundering in the Irish Sea, so you'll have to forgive me for that. So I've written something that's called Strangers Singing in a Strange Land. My family minister was of the old Calvinistic hue, a stirring preacher. I admired him as a child. I still think about him standing in the pulpit delivering his sermon. If you know the old, gallant 1950s minister in Marilyn Robinson's Gilead, that was the type of him. He took as his text once words from 1 Peter, "Live your life as strangers here, in reverent fear." He spoke about the Christian life as the calling to be a stranger. Even at its best, he said, this world would always be secondary to that true home beyond the blue. All else lay open for us, like a trap. He ended by quoting from the old American hymn, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through." It's a variation of a sermon which has echoed time and again from Protestant pulpits. Its roots, I suppose, run deep for my people, back to those rootless wanderers in the Bible, those strangers singing in a strange land. These words are from the Old Testament. They tell the story of God's children banished to the rivers of Babylon, singing for home. No other story has recalled Presbyterians to their consciences quite like that one. In volatile 17th century days, it drove us across seas and oceans in search of steadier ground. These days, though, I question the affinity with an exiled people, given its Presbyterian ministers who've been doing so much of the banishing lately. In 2018, they voted to remove gay people from membership, to refuse baptism to children born to gay parents. They oppose a woman's right to choose. I wonder how it's possible to stick to such patriarchal, worldly values and still call it a protest. White, male, straight, could a minister like mine know what it feels like to be a stranger at home or in the world? And yet, I don't want this to be a polemic. I want instead to claim space for another Presbyterian world, which until Susan's book, I'd long struggled to put into words. When I was a child, I was brought up for long stretches on McKay Mountain, just beyond Ballycastle, by my grandmother and her kin. My mother, my aunt, old second cousins dropping in, all faraway blue eyes and high cheekbones, but largely it was a woman's world. The major business of their lives was hill farming and God. In the case of the latter, a silence was kept, not for fear of immodesty in front of strangers. We were alone for much of the time on the mountain, but a special silence which suggested a certain reverence, an awe I had no cause to question. God's listening, they'd say. The Bible would be read, source texts for the cadences in their speech. Noah, Sarah, Abraham, Elijah, a roll call of stories, but no attempt made to explain away their strangeness. The book would be put away, Pete got in to warm the room, and things would fall back into silence. It's between you and the man above, Granny would say, of the personal quality of her faith. With God at your back, you could do anything. It stayed with me, this sense of an unseen God setting all things in motion, like some disturbance in the trees. Sometimes I wonder whether it wasn't the mountain which had made our religion, like for Moses and any number of biblical mountain wanderers. There were times when every flower, every beast, seemed to carry in it some great intention, as if, for a second, God had decided to breathe on the ashes of something wonderful, to show just to us. A full moon or the white flash of a butterfly recollected some departed soul that God had decided to put before our minds. A small mind in a broad field could grow one day, Granny said, into a mountain 3 times the size of Knocklead, if God willed. There were fairies, but better care was paid to livestock. But surrounding everything, a great silence, continuous, unremarked. It was my first lesson in words I'd learned later, grace, or a recognition that God's communication comes not in statements, but through the world in front of you. No experience ever settled, always wanting, but meaning so much because it's yours, because it has been addressed to you. There's something profound in a vision of God that could inspire a person's best judgments. I linger on this because people have asked me about this natural Presbyterianism I have described in the book. They take it to be something exceptional, but I realise it hasn't been. I have known any number of Fran Presbyterian women who have taken from their personal relationship with God a rugged individualism and a democratic sense of what they owe to the stranger. These women have been raised to ask of everything, will this leave us free? Pity them, the bold young minister, presuming to pay a concerned visit on points of doctrine. He has been careful not to cook any pots as he made a hasty retreat down the drive. Since coming out as gay and finding myself a stranger in the church, I've thought back to the strangers the women in my family were. I'd look up at them sitting at the table, each of them like strange planets in their austere grandeur, or up on the mountain alone, driving their cattle. And I have thought also of the strangers who found a sanctuary in their orbit. I'm thinking of San Marianne, a farm labourer and a transsexual who wore the finest fashions. She'd come up the mountain to my grandmother, who clothed her in pleated skirts from garage sales which Granny held to raise money for charity and the church. Plenty would have frowned upon the decision. San Marianne herself would later be buried in a man's suit. But my mother, a girl at the time of these visits, was told to ask no questions and to sit still. I don't want to sentimentalise. The women who raised me would never self-identify as radicals. Their individualism can, in another light, be read as exceptionalist, their lonesomeness alienating. If asked about politics, they'd ask you to leave them out, please. But these things can be misunderstood. I'm proud Susan gave space to someone like my Aunt Anna in the book, and that my aunt agreed to speak. She's the least likely person in the world to take part in the book. When I suggested to Susan I might feel able to talk to my aunt about being gay for the first time, we didn't know that she wouldn't cut off the interview. She would have had a right. But instead, in a situation which could easily have been overwhelming, she rose slowly, steadily to the humanity of the moment. She paused, took her own measure of things, and responded in love. Having felt so stuck between worlds for so long, I had no idea then how generative a conversation like that could be. Her taking me seriously inspired me to take what we share seriously. To reconcile parts of my background I felt I had to leave behind. What a lovely blessing to send me on my way, to take with me some foundation onto new and shifting ground. I work in the community now as a youth worker, in a Baptist church actually. I draw on my background a lot. At youth we read the Bible for its prophetic imagination and its gaps. We love discovering the plural meanings of old Hebrew words and mining their creative possibilities. We love to take a stand with Lot's wife, who, looking back at Sodom in flames, chose to bear witness to divine injustices. Where there are differences in our readings, I love the dignity we find in those differences. I've recently started running non-faith LGBTQ+ groups at church too. We have a changing area for trans young people who are still working things out. We talk through self-harm, paint our nails, and celebrate queer history. Talking to these vibrant, creative young people, I regret that churches still insist that a scattering of verses stand between them and a full embrace of these strangers. I grieve the prophets we could have had. It used to be a source of sadness to me that Protestants didn't have their myths. They're digging deep into the stories of the land, like you'd find in Heaney. The ones on offer seemed only to tell of sieges and sellouts, but that's not my tradition. The thing about myths, though, when you go looking for them, is that the closest ones are often the hardest to detect. My minister spoke of the Christian life as the calling to be a stranger. And I know, given the conversation we had in this book, I can never share in his meaning. But still, it's moving to me, the idea that to be a Protestant is to be alive to that eternal human longing that poet John O'Donoghue describes. The one that insists on a door being kept open somewhere in every shelter we belong to. It's so much a part of us. It's in our wanderings and our hyphenated identities. It's in our country music. It's in the humanitarianism of the United Irishmen and the Quakers. It's in our obsession with wild creatures and the nights we've made for the fields with our deck chairs, waiting, hands lifted, for lightning that doesn't ever come. And it's right there from the start, when God enters the scene, in perhaps the deepest of our Protestant myths. Lech lecha, God says to Abraham, get up and go to the land which I will show you. The land I will show you, but not yet. There are crossings you must make along the way. As feminists, as queers, as activists, and as Protestants, we live in a country not yet formed. But in the words of the old prophets, we glimpse it from afar. We usher it into reality through acts of courage. This finds expression in so many of the stories shared in this book. I hope you will read them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I first met Anton. I was giving a reading in London, and he rocked up with I'm shorter than Anton. Anton rocked up at my reading in London with a box of homemade 15s, and it was love at first sight, and we've been great pals ever since. It's nice to see you guys laughing. It's really, really hard to tell whether everyone hates you or not whenever you've got your mouths covered. So if you can try and smile with your eyes for the next 8 minutes, that would be fab. My name's Jan, and like Anton, I am from a Presbyterian background as well. I can tell I'm very much at home tonight because we've got 3 empty chairs at the front row, so there's clearly a lot of Presbyterians in the room. I realised I was giving an 8-minute presentation about 38 minutes ago, so you are going to get lots of linked up thoughts tonight. Hopefully it will come together. If not, you can listen to the other 2 who are a lot more wise and eloquent than I am. I'm going to talk about the thing which I love to talk about most, which is myself. I hope that's okay. I was really delighted when Susan asked me to speak to her for this book, and I was particularly delighted when she began to tell me about some of the other people who were in the book. About 4 years ago, I'm a community arts facilitator as well as a writer, and about 4 years ago I did a community arts project in Turf Lodge with a group of women up there, and lads, it was one of the best 6 weeks of my life. These women, we were recreating scenes from classic movies, and until you have dressed up as Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman and recreated that with a bunch of elderly ladies, you haven't lived. But a few weeks into the project, we were comfortable with each other, and we began to ask questions. Why do you lot do that? Why do you lot do that? What do you do at a wedding? What do you do at a funeral? And it was really kind of eye-opening for me, because I'd never been in a space where I could ask questions that kind of graphically of people who were raised in a very different background than I was. And they interrogated me about being a rural Presbyterian. And about 2 questions in, one of them said, "Here, why is there so many denominations of you lot? There's only one kind of version of us." And it really struck with me, and I know that's an oversimplification, but I have been carrying that for a long time. This idea that when I travel around Europe and the world and I'm asked about what it means to be a Protestant in Northern Ireland, it feels like there's a very defined, fixed idea. And it's just one thing. And as Susan pointed out at the start, it tends to be a white, elderly man guldering at somebody. Thanks a lot, Paisley. And yet, in my experiences, like Susan's book shows, there are multiple different versions of Protestants. There are as many of them as there are people. Everybody's story is unique. And I think that comes across in the book. And so what I wanted to do very briefly for a few minutes is show how the conversation that I had with Susan really informed my latest book. See, I am linking it to the new book, so I hope that you'll all go and buy a copy of it. This is The Raptures. I was writing it at the time that I had the conversation with Susan, so a lot of what we talked about has really leaked into this. It's set in 1993 in a fictional rural village outside Ballymena. You can do a bit of digging into my background and work out which fictional village it is if you want. There are only 5 villages outside Ballymena. And it's about a little girl called Hannah, who's 11. And Hannah's having the worst summer of her life. Things are starting to go terribly wrong in Ballylack. And I wanted to begin with, I'm going to read you 2 passages. I'm going to begin with this one because it speaks very much at the end to that idea of there being so many different versions of what it means to be not just a Protestant in Northern Ireland, but a person from Northern Ireland. There's as many versions as there are us. We don't usually have women taking assembly. It's nearly always ministers, and ministers are always men. Sorry, Heather. They come in to do a wee Bible lesson and say a prayer. The best ones bring puppets or flannel graph. Sometimes we sing a couple of choruses, but only if it's one of Mrs. Getty's days with P5. She's the only teacher who knows how to play the piano, and the singing sounds woeful without it. Like cats in a tumble dryer, says Kathleen. The ministers are never from our church, because our church isn't in Ballylack. It's in the town, 5 miles away. Pastor Bill wouldn't mind driving out. It's just that there's half a dozen other churches in the village, and they get first dibs on visiting our school. Dad says it's okay to listen to other ministers. They're Protestants like us, just a different kind. We're the evangelistic, charismatic sort, which means we believed in getting saved and going to hell. Jesus and also the Holy Spirit. In our church, the women wear hats. We use the Bible with the old-fashioned words, but sing modern choruses off the overhead projector. We speak in tongues and do special praying with hands on. We don't believe in the cinema or chewing gum. The chewing gum thing might just be my parents, because I've seen ones from the youth fellowship blowing bubblegum bubbles round the back of the minor hall. We're not the popular kind of Protestant. There aren't that many of us. In Ballylack, there's only us and Granny and Mrs. Nugent. In the town, it's a bit better. There's enough to fill a medium-sized church. At Christmas and Easter, it's pretty bunged. Granda Pete's not our sort of Protestant. I'm not sure what kind he actually is. Granda says prods are like potatoes. There's 5 dozen different varieties. They're all much of a muchness when you peel them back. It's nice that you get a clap here. You don't get a clap at book festivals. These are a nice crowd. So it took me 15 years to write The Raptures, and I want to talk about this briefly and then I'll pass on to Scott. I have been writing seriously for 15 years. This is my 7th book. It was actually the 2nd book I started to write, but it came out so incredibly angry and bitter. I knew it wasn't the right time to publish it. I needed to put it in a drawer. I needed to grow up a bit before I wrote it, because I wanted to write something about evangelical Protestantism in Northern Ireland. It's not really explored much in our art. A lot of political exploration of what it means to be a Protestant, a lot of exploration of the culture, not a terrible amount about that born-again culture where people's faith impacts everything they believe, their moral choices, how they see the world. And yet, as you all know, it's hugely significant to a lot of people, not least some of the politicians that we live under every day. So I wanted to write something about that. But I wanted to write something that was nuanced, that wasn't just a place for me to stick all of the things that had hurt me and angered me growing up, because there's so much about the way I grew up that I really, really appreciate. And I've tried to pour some of that into this novel. I've tried to talk a lot about the community, because folks, there was nothing as safe or nurturing as growing up in a rural Presbyterian community in the 90s. I know Anton has talked a lot about that kind of idea of being an outsider, and I can talk about that too, but I can also talk about people who really knew me, who were there for me, who when they said they would pray for you, really did flip and pray for you for like 40 years. You had to tell them to stop sometimes. So a real network of community and support. A safety. There's something about that particular Northern Irish brand of evangelical Christianity where you don't really have to think. And I don't particularly think that's a good thing in the long run. But growing up, I didn't have to deal with the grey areas of what did I think about this issue or this issue. Somebody in a pulpit told me how to think. And that's, as a child, that can feel quite safe. It's only when you start to get out into the world and you realise that it's a bit more complicated than that you start to realise it could be a negative thing as well. But there was a safety in the way I grew up. And finally, I think there was a real sense of culture. And we Protestants are sometimes seen as a bit dour, a bit lacking in humour. Protestants can really tell stories. They know how to do that. I've sat at enough bunworries to know that Protestants can tell stories. There's a richness to the music. I still miss it. I'm not attending a church at the minute, and I miss so bad the old hymns. Particularly at Christmas for some reason, the language of them, the lustre with which people sing. And as a young writer, I just loved that. I used to listen to that line, I diffused a quickening ray. And I remember being 8 years old and going, how do you do that with words? That's amazing. So there was so much about my culture that I grew up with that I do love and appreciate. I've tried to pour that into this book. But there's also a lot of stuff that's problematic, folks. And Anton has pointed out his experience of what was problematic. Some of it for me was being a woman. I'm a leader. I know how to speak. I can captivate a room. I know how to do that. But I couldn't get up in a pulpit in the church that I grew up in to do that. And that felt really restrictive and, to be honest, wrong. And when I looked at the Bible, I didn't, there's plenty of women leading in the Bible. I couldn't understand where it came from. So a lot of it is around women. But for me, my big bugbear, and I will finish with this and try and leave it on an optimistic thing, is there was something about that particular faith, and I'm not saying it's in every church, but definitely the way I grew up, that sucked the mystery out of faith. And if you have any creative bent, if you're an artist in any way, you're drawn to mystery. I don't want a 3-point sermon that tells me what to do. I want to grapple and wrestle, and I want to try and know the divine and find out about it. And that's what I talk about in my conversation with Susan, which you can read in a much more eloquent way, hopefully, in the book. But it really clicked for me one day, sitting under the little banner in our pulpit in church that said Ardens sed Verens, which basically, my Latin's not great, but I think it means burning but not consumed. And did you ever hear a better definition of what it means to be an artist? Burning but not consumed. That you're constantly burning with this desire to create and to wrestle and to think. And in no way did that join up with what was coming out of the pulpit. In absolute no way. So I've wrestled my whole life with that. I'm an artist. I've been an artist since the day I set foot on this planet. Probably always going to be an artist. And I'm always going to wrestle and want to know and to go deeper. And so that's in this book, and I'll finish with this short couple of paragraphs. The book wrestles, it is a 3-point sermon, it wrestles with 3 things which catchily boil down into alliterative points. So it's about the miraculous, the magical and the mythical. It's a good Presbyterian sermon here. And how those 3 things intertwine. And Hannah's grown up with this incredibly kind of didactic idea of her faith. Over the course of the summer, there's a mysterious illness in Ballylack, and her friends, her primary school friends, begin to get ill and die. And they come back to her as ghosts. And she has no space in her worldview for where you can fit that. It's, what do you do with this? Are we minds blowing? And that was a wee bit the same for me the first time I picked up Wuthering Heights. And many of you will know what I'm talking about. It could have been the first time that you listened to a piece of classical music that blew your head off, or the first time you looked at a painting. But there was something magical that happened to me that I've been trying to reconcile with my faith for the rest of my life, and I probably always will. So this is Hannah having her mind-blowing moment, and then we'll pass on to Scott. Hannah sees things differently now. Last week, there were two kinds of magic in her world. The holy magic God does with angels and miracles, and the other bad magic which they sometimes pray against. Witches, demons, ghosts and Satanists who'd sacrifice children if they got the chance. Other people think this kind of stuff is made up or harmless. In Hannah's church, they know the devil is real. They won't let their children dress up at Halloween for fear of giving Satan a foothold. They don't mess around with cures or fairy blessings or any of that sort of thing. Hannah's always understood and complied. No Halloween, no worst witch books, no reading horoscopes at the back of Granda's paper, no raggedy tree. It doesn't matter how harmless it looked in Miss McEwen's photo. She wouldn't want to get close to it. She can't risk giving the devil a foothold. But since Ross appeared, she's been a bit confused. She assumes she's had an encounter with evil. An actual dead person came to see her. She's not quite ready to call Ross a ghost. Yet it hadn't felt wrong in the moment. It was just like talking to an ordinary person, albeit a very quiet one. And Jesus had been there. He'd given Hannah the words to say. This makes no sense. No sense at all, for God can't stand evil. The Bible's pretty clear on this. Maybe everything's more complicated than she thought. What if Pastor Bill's not always right? Where does this leave her and all the other forbidden things? Dinosaurs, leprechauns, Paul Daniels' magic programme, which she's not allowed to watch, but sometimes does secretly with Granda when Granny's not at home. The roof is peeling off Hannah's brain. This morning, the church feels very small. The men in their dark suits glaring, the women in their funny hats, the old-fashioned hymns with old-fashioned words, so different from the music the ones in school like listening to. The praying and the fasting, especially the fasting. It seems daft to think you can get God's attention just by skipping your Cocoa Pops. Hannah knows Pastor Bill would have a pink fit if she said any of this to him. If she marched up after the service and said, "Here, some people don't go straight to heaven after they die," I'd only quote Bible verses at her. I'd only tell her she was wrong. Thanks, folks.
Thanks very much to our first two speakers. So now we're just going to get the equipment ready to play Scott, the third speaker. But I'm going to make a public service announcement. Some of you maybe have seen me chair before, and I can be quite ruthless in telling people their time is up. And I thought the contributions tonight were so compelling, I was going to be quiet and not tell anybody, even if it had gone beyond the required 8 minutes. But that also means we do have a restriction on time tonight in the venue. So to deal with that, I'm going to have to say we'll need to cut the abstracts. So after Scott's contribution is played the reflection, we'll just play the reflection and then we'll give Heather her chance to come up and respond. Because if we don't, I think we'll run into issues with the time tonight, unless somebody in the back wants to correct me. But I think we'll need to just go straight to Heather. So sorry to the panelists for depriving you the chance for your extract, but you can all buy the book and read the whole thing rather than hearing some extracts as well. So thanks for that.
Hello everyone, and sorry I couldn't be there in person. I've come down with the coronavirus. I'm down with the Rona, as they say. I suppose what I really loved about Susan's book was the diversity of what we call Northern Protestants in the early 2020s. I remember in one event Susan said that perhaps there won't be a third book because of the way the demographics are changing so rapidly here. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I think things are changing, but perhaps not the way that is portrayed on the BBC, which seems to be wishful thinking in one regard, and that is the idea of the kind of liberal narrative that everyone will move towards some version of normal. And I hate to be pessimistic, but I think that the shifting ground is happening in a very simple way, whereby the population of Protestants, loyalists who will vote for unionism or the maintenance of the union is dwindling. And I think the big victim, not again to sound like BBC Radio Ulster, but the community that I'm from, which is, the working class Protestant community, there is a real danger here of being left behind. I know we're always hearing about it, but in terms of moving forward to some kind of new constitutional arrangement, for instance, if you are a left-wing Irish Republican, you're probably not going to get the United Ireland, the 32 county socialist republic that you're after in this climate. So it won't just be Northern Unionists who will be unhappy if there was to be a United Ireland. But the thing about that is, I do think that most middle class Unionists will, or Protestants, will eventually and very easily find themselves quite comfortable in some kind of new arrangement, whatever that may be. Whereas I do think that because of the problems in education, there are deeper issues within loyalist communities, which just aren't being addressed in any meaningful way. It can't be the case that, or I can never see a reason for a middle class political class, such as we have in the DUP, really understanding what is going on in working class communities. And these are the communities on both sides of our sectarian divide that go out and enact the violence. But then maybe I'm just overly pessimistic about the way things are going. And I suppose in terms of common good and the future, if I was to set aside my pessimism for what is about to inevitably happen here, I think that there is, as much as I'm not religious and I was never baptized, although I am a Protestant just by my family connections, I do see hope in religious quarters from, various religious leaders within Protestantism who want to move things forward, who want to cross over and make alliances with the other side. I do see them doing that a lot more than anyone else. I'm just not sure how that would trickle down in any meaningful way, because to enact change, real change, the political structures have to change, and I don't think the future that I want really exists with any of the political regimes on this archipelago at the current moment. And that's unfortunate, but I suppose a book like this, it's shown me things that I just would never have been able to see, and hearing stories that I wouldn't have ever heard. And it's great that it's done so well, especially in the South. But it's a completely different experience. It's a completely different universe than the one that I'm being presented with on the BBC. I mean, for instance, the extract from the interview with Kenny McFarland, which I'll be reading tonight. Kenny McFarland's talking about this, his lived reality of being head of the Londonderry Bands Forum, and saying how working class Protestants from new buildings will go out and parade during the day and then head into Derry to go drinking with their, nationalist or Catholic friends. And I'm not seeing too much of this on the media at all. And this isn't some kind of wishful thinking movement towards normality, because normality doesn't really exist. Normality is what we make it. And to be honest, I'm actually seeing the media narrative which is actually counter to that, which is more interested in pushing some kind of vendible politics, or some image of politics here, which doesn't quite add up to the social reality. So I suppose there is hope when you zoom in and you watch what's actually going on. And that's where Susan's book, I think, really excels. But when you zoom out and you look at what is actually going on in the politics, it is extremely depressing. And I suppose in some ways that is slightly anti-religious in a way, because I'm talking about there is no need to transcend in some ways. The things that are happening, if people let them happen, are going to happen anyway.
Thank you for the conversation this evening, and thank you for the honesty and the grace with which folks have spoken. Shifting ground is such a powerful image, so rich, so much depth. Some of you will know that some of the footbridges over the Lagan River bounce when you walk or run over them. Now you'll be trying it next time you're there. My granddaughter, who is now 3, and I developed a habit that when we were crossing one of those bridges, the one at Edenderry, before it was fixed, we would get halfway over, we'd check that nobody else was coming, and then the two of us would jump up and down as much as we possibly could, both of us laughing, both of us enjoying that movement of the ground beneath our feet. And one day when we'd finished our jumping and went down to the other side of the towpath, a man was waiting there with 2 small children, and I said, I was sorry for holding him back. And he said, no, that was absolutely fine. But he said, there was no way on earth I was going up there with you 2 jumping and that bridge moving the way it was. Thinking about tonight and listening tonight, it struck me once again that shifting ground, moving ground, is both exciting and frightening. It can have us grabbing for something stable or enjoying the experience. Shifting ground is such a powerful image because what it evokes in me might be radically different to what it evokes in you, and both are valid. Shifting ground is a universal experience. Everything changes. And yet intensely personal and individual. There's mystery, as I've listened to Jan, there's mystery in shifting ground because we can't control it. Listening this evening, I wondered if there was something to be explored in acknowledging that what we have in common across and within all our diversity is change. Our common ground, in the language of this festival, is that the ground is shifting. We've pointed again and again to the diversity, even in Protestantism tonight. Our politics is shifting. Scott's alluded to that in what he's just said. Church is shifting and wrestling. I heard that again in what Jan said about longing for spaces where we can be honest and really, really grapple. For some, that change is good news. For many, it's not. I was so struck, Susan, by your phrase in the book. Unionism is heartsick for the days of its dominance, but those days are never going to come back. They're never going to come back. And Scott's just highlighted that in what he said. Shifting ground is uncomfortable. Susan, in her introduction, said that she and Anton visited various churches, and she kindly and enigmatically left that sentence hanging. Anton spoke so powerfully about what it feels like to be made a stranger in an exiled land. So I'll state the obvious. The conversation this evening, the book as you read it, is not easy ground for someone like me, who's committed to church as a source of good for everybody. When I was minister up in Dundonald Methodist, a picture, a hope for us was that even folks who wouldn't even think of going to church for various reasons would be glad that church was there, because through programmes for women or lads and dads or community engagement around poverty, that church was a source of goodness, a source of kindness in that community. I'm uncomfortable tonight because there's not much of that picture in this book. There are stories of life and hope. Both Jan and Anton graciously pointed to those. But the fact is that when the church is talked about, it's usually as an historic event and often as a source of sectarianism, a place where those with around the spectrum of sexuality are hurt, or where issues like abortion are avoided. Church is seen as fundamentally irrelevant or seen as a negative force. Pamela Dennison in her interview puts it so strongly when she says the church has a lot to answer for in Northern Ireland. What the church leaders said in what turned out to be a controversial service of reflection and hope in Armagh in October is deeply significant in that context of discomfort. Archbishop John McDowell put it like this: "Now, as a church leader, I'm sorry that as disciples of Jesus, we didn't do more to become peacemakers, or at least speak peace into the situation. Too often, we allowed the attitudes around us to shape our faith rather than the other way round." And I add my voice to that apology. And listening to what Anton shared tonight, I want to add an apology to the way in which folks who are LGBTQ have been hurt. We haven't engaged. We haven't listened. Jan spoke graciously about the values with which she grew up, but also spoke about hurts caused. It's uncomfortable ground. And it's uncomfortable for politicians too, because the book evidences, and Scott spoke to it, that there's a strand in political unionism which progresses their identity by raising fear and concern in unionist communities. We need more positive unionist voices. And I have to be honest, as I read this book, I heard those voices in the voices of women, especially the Thran, strong women who Anton pointed to, who keep the door ajar. This conversation might be uncomfortable for the church, it's uncomfortable for politicians, but here's the bottom line: our discomfort is not the primary issue here. Because most of us in this room are not the ones most radically and profoundly affected by this shifting ground. The fact is that the shifting ground is more likely to feel exciting and challenging when you come from a place of security or power or privilege. But when everything else around you feels insecure, whereas Dale Pankhurst said in this book, a flag is all that people really do have to cling to, where life is uncertain, then more shifting ground is another burden to bear. Stephen Donnan Danzel put it so well when they talk about people on the Shankill who lost relatives in the Shankill bomb, where he said it's hard for them to look past the constitutional issue because it's not just about their place in the Union or their place in United Ireland, it's about the people they buried. Eileen Weir in the Shankill Women's Centre talks about women's common experience of health and housing and education and welfare that kept many of them and their families in a constant stress. Being poor, wrote Susan, was a full-time occupation. In a context like this, I want to suggest that if we, from all our different perspectives, are up for venturing onto common ground together, well, it's in places like the Shankill with people like Eileen, or in places like Monkstown with people like Paul, that we need to stand. People who in their communities are making a radical difference. Shifting ground's uncomfortable. Second thing that struck me again and again as I read the book and as I listened tonight is that this is us. In the context of this book, I heard a call to inclusive unionism. In the context of tonight and of this conference, I want to broaden that, prompted so much by what Anton said, to an inclusive mindset. I remember what Anton said was the epitome of that for me, where he was honest and determined not to develop into a polemic. That grace that speaks in that way. I remember a Methodist conference where we were listening and speaking about sexuality, and one person stood up and said, please, don't frame this conversation as us and them, whoever your us and them might be. He said, I'm gay. You have children, friends who are gay. There are folks in your congregations who are gay. This is not a conversation about them and us. This is a conversation about us. And by that he meant the whole church. By that he meant the whole of society. Susan highlighted that part of her motivation for writing this book was to highlight the diversity that's in Northern Protestantism. Jan echoed that, speaking about wonderful diversity, so many versions of what it is to be us. This is us, with all our wonderful, beautiful, broken, messed up diversity. This is us. And this is a huge challenge politically, because our politics for generations, and we know it, have been based on us and them and on competition. I loved the conversation of which Susan speaks in the book, which talks about trying so hard to signal beyond stereotypes. So that one couple used Londonderry because they thought the man trimming their trees was a Protestant, and the kindness of him coming back with, was it 5 dairies in the sentence, because he thought they were Catholic. It's a step forward. It speaks about grace. It speaks about the inherent kindness that's all around us. It's a step forward. But the fact is, because we recognise ourselves in those conversations, it shows us how deep division goes in all of us. But if Susan's right in the book, that plenty of people, including unionists, are open-minded about identity and nationhood, will we step up and encourage that conversation so it takes place in the public square rather than behind closed doors? This is us. But our us and them might not be politics. It might be about difference in our understanding of sexuality or ethics. We make our judgments so quickly and easily. Or our challenge might be power. I think that's another one that we as a church need to address. Some of you will differ on this with me, but it seems to me that church doesn't have a place at the table as a right. I believe it in my bones and in my being, that Christianity has important perspectives to bring to the building of the common good. I believe that in my very bones. But church must come to the common ground with a tone of humility as well as gentle confidence, recognizing and not being threatened by difference, rejoicing in diversity. Sir Jan Carson, who's the president of the Methodist Church in Ireland, put it really well when he preached at the service of reflection. He said this: embracing different others isn't about promoting oneself, it's about creating space for the other to flourish. It's about choosing relationship over being right. This is what Christian practice is. Choosing relationship over being right. And again I heard tonight a call to places where we can speak together, where we can grapple, where we can try and understand each other and help each other on this journey. Alan McBride echoed it in his invitation to choose relationship, where he says in the book, "My thing is now that if the question is about making a difference, how are you likely to make the most difference?" I know for me that that comes whenever I'm able to talk to people across a table or in a room like this and get to know them. Those tables are the places where in relationship we can grapple and wrestle. The old binaries are blurring. It's what Four Corners is all about. The challenging, shifting ground becomes common ground when we recognise the cost and the effort and still affirm that we won't be bound by us and them, because this is us. Shifting ground becomes common ground when we're committed to more than ourselves and look around and ask what voices are missing, what voices aren't being heard. I wonder tonight, is that around victims and survivors? I wonder, are those voices the ones who are scared to speak? I was so struck by the number of people in this book who didn't want their names being added to the conversation, and they were right to do that, sadly, because of the context they're in. May God forgive us. I love the idea of a colourful coalition of unlikely friends who differ radically with each other on some issues, who are up for grappling and speaking together, and who are utterly, utterly committed to each other and to the common good. Shifting ground's uncomfortable. This is us. And this book resounds with hope. Anton spoken about Anna, whose voice, whose response resounds with hope. Hope dances through many of the voices captured in this book. Don't tell me there's no such thing as hope. The stories told of public and quiet kindnesses, of quiet generosity. I couldn't agree more with Susan's analysis tonight, that the unfinished work, or part of it, is on reconciliation. And standing here as a church person, there's such a depth of understanding of what reconciliation means in the scriptures if we do the sort of grappling that we've been encouraged to do tonight, if we do that sort of listening. I want to end with some words of Susan's. Yet while writing this book, I met many people who are living reconciled lives as envisaged in the Good Friday Agreement, who are determined, and it's going to take determination, who are determined to make this place work for its many communities, whatever the constitutional future. Shifting ground becomes common ground as we seek the common good, and all around us and in this room and far beyond this room are people who are determined to make this place work for its many communities and every community, whatever the constitutional future. And I, for one, say amen to that. Thanks.
I'll just briefly say thanks so much to all the panellists, and also a special thanks to Susan for, I suppose, helping us to start this conversation, to enable us to have it and to enable us to hear these voices. So Maida now has a few announcements.
Wow, what a panel, right? Well done. I'm so encouraged by this talk tonight, and I hope you all are too. So thank you to Susan and the panel for being here. And also, just so you all know, Susan's books, both of them are going to be available for purchase for £17 right outside here. If you can't buy them tonight or you're at home, please stop at No Alibis and pick up all of the books from this lovely panel. As well, donations are again being accepted for the sustainability of the festival. So there are red boxes for donation by cash, and then also you can find the QR code outside, and do please fill out a questionnaire giving us some responses. As you're leaving, please do maintain social distancing and enjoy the rest of your night and the rest of the festival. Thank you.